Northumberland Public Library presents Continuing the Conversation.
We were just going to get started, and we were talking about the high school to prison pipeline. So I thought maybe we could start, maybe just go down the row, and Trinity, we could start with you. And I'd love to hear first your definition of what that is, and how you've seen it, how maybe if it's affected you or what you've seen.
I have not personally been affected by the school to prison pipeline, but I will say personally, I think how I would define it is it's the pathway for low income, usually minority students from high school straight to prison. These are kids who are constantly disciplined in schools, even for just minor infractions. And they tend to go straight from school to prison, which is, the literal definition of school to prison pipeline. And unfortunately, it is a very high statistic, and it's something that's seen nationwide. It's not just small town. It's definitely happening at a higher rate in the bigger cities. And I'm sure if I looked at the stats in just Virginia alone, it would be disturbing to most people, but it's not talked about here. And I think it is something, especially since our area has the Northern Neck Regional Jail. I think if we were to look at the school to prison pipeline, maybe info from the Northern Neck, we would see a decent number, which isn't surprising to me, but I feel like as more people are educated on the topic, they'll start to see the trend too. And like I said, it's nationwide, but it usually it occurs in Black male populations. So that would be my definition.
Fortunately, I've never had to go to court for being charged or accused of committing a crime. But my experience with it just has to do with the fact of the way that the school system disciplines children of all races and backgrounds, but really disproportionately marginalized students. So that includes students who are African American, and it's mostly male, but it also includes students who may not be African American, may be Caucasian, but aren't connected with the leaders of the school, aren't connected with the teachers of the school because of their economic status. So it does affect everyone, but it disproportionately affects people who are low income, disproportionately affects people who are African American, people of minority status. And just with me personally, there were some times where I was disciplined by the school. So there was a time where I got into a scuffle with a kid, and I ended up getting suspended from school, where over time, you can see that if a white student got into a similar scuffle or something like that, they would not have gotten that form of discipline. And then there was another time where I was got in-school suspension, which essentially is a form of jail, because when you look at it, essentially you're put into a room, you're put into a cell, you can't talk, you're controlled, and there's an overseer, and the only thing that's missing are the bars. In fact, it would probably be better if there were bars, because the walls that surround you, you're not even able to see the people that sit beside you. And there's that prison culture that essentially it's preparing students of a certain demographic to get used to being treated this way, instead of actual reconciliation, instead of actual learning. Is treating students to get to the state will isolate you and will put you under extreme mental stress and separate you from society if one person or another doesn't agree with the way that you have acted due to no due to really just your environment, because at that point you're a kid. I was like in elementary school. So essentially criminalization from a young age is what the prison pipeline is about. When you start off suspending students and isolating them from society as a form of punishment, you get them used to that, and you don't have any reconciliation. So they're angry at society, and some may be. I was very fortunate because of my parents and having a two-parent household, but that's not always the case for people. So you kind of set them up to have this antagonistic relationship with the state, and that already puts them on a bad path once they get out into society and live their own. And being in the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, I've seen many kids who I went to school with, either victims of crime or perpetrators of crime. And you look at the files and you're like, man, you can see why, because knowing them in school. And then you can also see how they could have been helped if they had the right help early on. So that's my experience with it, and that's how I understand it.
I also haven't been personally affected by the school to prison pipeline. Most of what I know about it is based on like my own research and the experience of peers that I know. But when I think about it, I think about like the multiplicity of ways that people of color are marginalized. So when I think about the school to prison pipeline, I'll think about food deserts, the difference between the education systems in poorer, more Black or Hispanic areas as compared to public schools with more Caucasian students. And then I also think about zero tolerance policies, where a lot of schools hand, I think Denzel mentioned this, hand disciplinary action with students to the courts instead of dealing with them in schools. And so that already puts records on a lot of kids and gets them used to dealing with like the criminal system at a young age. And then I also know that Black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled from their schools. And as far as my personal experience, I went to Christ Church, and I've gone to private school for most of my life. But I did notice a difference in the way that the school handled situations with Black students versus white students. And I know that sometimes the assumptions made about Black students made it harder for the school to deal with those situations, just based on like the assumptions that were made about them.
Just riding off what they were saying, is to me, same with me. I haven't really had any personal experience of it, but I do know it exists and it's real. But it's just the very early on criminalization of Black youth and other marginalized groups, primarily the male demographic of that group. And I think a big part of it too is representation, and that's why representation in schools matters. Having people that come from your communities and look like you and can sympathize, not just sympathize, but empathize with you and your situation and why you may be acting the way you're acting. And another thing too, it seems like a lot of the time disciplinary actions are always approached with a very reactive way of going about, instead of a proactive and doing preventative work and things like that. But that's what those are some observations I have on it.
Okay, so here we are, we're this group who has defined what the school to prison pipeline looks like. And it sounds to me like all of you are saying that, first of all, we don't have the right system in place to help our teachers to understand that discipline should be the same across the board for everyone. So there needs to be some training there. And then the other thing we don't have is we don't have a way for those marginalized kids to even get out of that horrible cycle. And so we need to create that, see what that looks like, and how do we get them out of that cycle. I feel like there has to be something that we can do on our side that can help to stop this cycle. And it sounds like we need some training. It sounds like we also need a way for those people who are marginalized and are, I don't want to say picked on. It sounds like the way I'm understanding from you all is they get into this rut and they just can't ever get out. So they're always the ones who get in trouble. They're always the ones who whose grades are bad. They're always the ones who are getting ISS. Believe it or not, I had ISS. When I was in high school, I was in ISS for 3 days. It was horrible. I totally get, Denzel, what you're saying. And it was because I was reading a book during my social studies class instead of studying the notes on the board. And my teacher actually came over, took the book out of my hand and hit me on the head with it. He did not get in trouble. I did. But then my parents called the school and said, hey, no teacher has a right to hit a student no matter what. So he got disciplined. Well, that made it even worse for me in the classroom. And I never did another thing right in his classroom, which was horrible. But the ISS experience was not a pleasant experience because you really are in jail. I totally get it. And and it's not something that I would want to repeat. And I, of course, only had to experience it for 3 days, but I know of kids in my school who were in it constantly, never seemed to be able to get out of it. And I went to a school that had no minorities whatsoever. It was all white. Of course, this was, 40 years ago, and in a very, very small town. So it was real, even in our school, but we did not have, I never heard of the school prison pipeline. But I'm sure now that I think back that some of those students, I can remember them going to jail. I can remember them having the same kind of issues. When I mentioned the school to prison pipeline today to someone, they said, well, a lot of it is drugs. Do you guys agree with that? And where do we go from here?
I'm sorry you had that experience because I had the same one and I don't think it's a great one. And I think that you point out that to a certain extent, if we were to fix this, it would help all people. It is disproportionately affecting a certain population, minority groups, males, but it would help all people if we could figure out a better way to discipline. I think the first thing we need to do is make sure that the training is there for teachers, that they realize that since students are under their jurisdiction for around 7-8 hours a day, they need to be people who understand how to discipline, not in a punitive way, but in a growing way. A part of school shouldn't just be you learning certain subjects. Should also be learning how you interact in civil society, because democracy and civil society interactions with people, respect, relationship respect, which is something we don't have enough. I think that we need to start with making sure that we make school more than just about teaching math, science, and history, which is important, but teaching people how to interact in civil society, because that's not something that comes natural. Ronald Reagan, is one of his most famous quotes is him talking about how democracy isn't something that's learned. It has to be taught from generation to generation. Well, part of that is learning how to interact with others and disagree with others in society. I think the other thing we need to learn how to do is another reform we should make is that when you're a student, oftentimes I found myself when I was in these situations where you have to go to the principal's office or be disciplined by someone that's a certain teacher. Sometimes the teacher was African American, so representation doesn't always matter. There's some African Americans who will come in and they'll be just as bad as some of the white teachers. And that's just lack of training. But when you're doing that, you're just a kid by yourself. You don't have any legal representation. You don't have any sort of support. Sometimes they won't call the parents. And you are very fortunate in your case because your parents are very involved. Sometimes the parents of these kids can't be involved because they're out working at a job where they're not even they're barely earning enough to take care of their kid, right? So we need to make sure that there's counselors, mental health counselors too, that are supporting students throughout the disciplinary process as well. Because if they don't have any help when it comes to presenting their side of the case, being interrogated by a principal is something that's very intimidating for an 8-7-year-old kid without any support. So we need to make sure that students have support throughout the disciplinary process as well, and make sure that disciplinary process is something that's actually teaching kids how to be better in society instead of making them angry at the state, which is what you end up doing.
Well, as a future educator, that's partially why I brought this topic up into our conversation last time, because obviously I feel very strongly about it. There aren't enough people advocating for these students. They are going literally from school to prison. And there's a big issue with that. And I'm not sure if there needs to be a more supportive environment within the school system, within their parental units, or if it's just about community engagement. But there's a missing link somewhere. And we've got to, get down and figure that out. And I don't know if it's maybe bringing in law enforcement and having them do training and giving lessons. And I don't know exactly what it is, but I know something needs to be done. Because like, I know you said something about someone in the area saying that it's probably drug related. It could be, but the issue is the kids are seeing something, they're reacting, like Denzel said, because they're used to being put in this situation. They're used to being put in ISS. They're used to being expelled for very little things often. If they're getting expelled for little things, I mean, honestly, their packets are about this big when they leave middle school. And then you have to think about them going to high school, and that's ridiculous. And I work within the school system. I see things. Kids see things. So it's not even an adult problem. It's an everybody problem. And I'm sure professional training needs to happen, not even just within the, small Northern Neck communities, but within all of them. And I know that larger cities are doing professional training and development. They've added that as part of their curriculum, because in places like Richmond, where you have, like, there was a VCU student, I think yesterday or the day before, he got gunned down, taken out his trash in Richmond. Those kind of things happen at a very large level. And unfortunately, unless we're going to talk about it, it's going to continue. And I think this is a conversation worth having. And I hope a lot of people not only listen to this, but listen to, obviously, Michael's really young. Colette, I guess we're all really young, but y'all are younger than me. And the fact that y'all are speaking up about it shows that there is a problem and that we've got to do something about it. And maybe the start of a solution is within us. Maybe it's us going to the community and saying, like, hey, this is the issue. This is what we think about it. What are we going to do about it? And I'm not sure if this is a 100 people task force event or just, the little we have today. But I know that these students need someone advocating for them. And Northumberland has a wonderful counseling department. I'm very lucky to work with them. But it has to be more than them. The counseling department, they're basically caregivers, they're educators, they're a shoulder to cry on and a listening ear. But it doesn't just need to be the counseling department. It doesn't just need to be mental health advocates. It needs to be the principal, the history teacher. It needs to be everyone showing that they support these kids and not just closing them off because they got sent to ISS once. Most people I know got a referral. I was very lucky where I didn't somehow, but I do know that I am a very passionate person. So if I feel like something needs to be said, I'm going to say it. And a lot of these kids are like that. But when their classmates say it, there's no issue. But when they say it, automatic, oh, you're getting ISS today. And I think that's absolutely ridiculous. And like I said, I think something needs to happen. And it happens a lot more than we think in Northumberland County.
I really agree with the emphasis you guys are putting on having advocates. And a big thing is being taught to advocate for self, because that's my ability to talk and articulate has helped me and opened up a lot of doors for me and keep me from getting jammed up with a lot of stuff, from situations with teachers and all types of stuff. And that's another thing too, holding staff and adults that have obligations to these students accountable. I've had teachers call me liar, question my character, and I'm like an 8th grade student.
I feel like one thing that makes it harder for a lot of marginalized students is that you notice at a young age that your school doesn't really care about protecting you. In many predominantly white schools, you'll have teachers that are racist, you'll have peers that are racist, and they're allowed to be racist with absolutely no punishment. And so I feel like that instills in you at a young age that that you're in a place where people are against you. And I've always learned growing up that as a Black person, individual, and especially as a Black woman, you're going to have to work twice as hard for half of the reward. In my own personal experience, I had a friend who went to Middlesex before they came to my high school, and they said they had a group of white students try to throw them into a trash can and call them slurs and the N-word, and then they got in trouble for trying to fight them off. But those students didn't get in any trouble. I've had many times where I've had white students call me the N-word. I've seen it happen all the time throughout my school, people coming to school with Confederate flags, spreading hate. And, you know, I see a lot of these kids just not get punished at all. And so it just, I feel like instills in you that, like, you know, if you're going to fight these issues, you're labeled as angry, like what Michael was saying, like behavioral problems, like not being able to understand what Black students are going through, and not being able to deal with it correctly at schools. For me personally, I noticed at a very young age that I was going to be exceptional because I feel like, especially Black women, have to be exceptional for people to pay attention to them. Like in the media, you see it really big on like things like TikTok. You have to really be like a wow thing for people to really pay attention to you. I felt like in order to get the respect of my teachers, I had to work a lot harder. The respect of my peers, I had to work a lot harder. And still, people who didn't know me and everything that I did for the school and my grade and stuff would make assumptions about me and my place in the school and what I did because they didn't know that. I didn't have that same just right to be there as I felt like my white peers had. And I feel like the one step to making this situation better for Black students is just having some sort of punishment or way to deal with racism, because it's just not fair that, you know, Black people are getting punished, you know, for fights and bringing things into school, but no one is getting punished for bringing severe hatred into their school environments. And what it does to their peers, it's just not getting recognized.
I just want to piggyback off of you real quick. One thing I've noticed as a Black woman, a young Black woman, is that Black people in particular are not allowed to be emotional. So anytime a Black student is emotional, it's brought about as they're angry. And that's part of the problem, those microaggressions. It doesn't matter if it's unintended. It literally anytime you're passion is often mistaken for anger or hatred. And I think that's a big part of the problem, because how can one student that is not Black be allowed to be emotional about an issue and a Black student can't? And so I think those are things that need to be looked at as well.
I also wanted to touch on, like, in some environments, the way that like this issue affects like Black men versus Black women also creates a gap between them. Like, especially at my private high school, I noticed that like the Black men, especially like the athletes, they got a lot more like appraisal and attention from the school for not doing like that much. And so when a lot of issues came up, a lot of them, when, you know, myself, I would go to them about these issues, they would just kind of shrug them off, say like it's fine, because like their experience and their place in that school was a lot different than mine was. Like I had a couple nicknames. I think they called me Commander in Chief because I was always trying to fix things or like bring up issues. And I think that it just creates kind of this sense of entitlement, and not just like white communities, but also within the Black community, the way that people deal with issues that they might not see for themselves, but they see in other people and just kind of ignore them. It just kind of like infiltrates all communities.
That's an interesting concept too, because when you're the benefactor of something that is kind of oppressing another group, it's harder to acknowledge that oppression is happening. And another thing you were saying, how you know, I've too heard white students call Black students the N-word and slurs and stuff like that. But it seems like, and the Confederate flag thing too, that's like really sensitive to me, because it seems like those very activist type progressive conversations are very like discouraged, but those things get a pass, like the Confederate flag and them wearing those things like that on shirts and on their cars to school and stuff. That's okay, but we can't have like an activism group or an activism club, and we can't talk about politics at school. But these are things that are affecting, you know, life, like in all different ways that affect us, and it's very obvious. Like I remember watching the Trump versus Hillary election thing in 6th grade, and it was just like everybody was talking about in the lunchroom. Like, these things do affect us, so it's even more important to have those conversations, and that's starting to happen now. So that's cool.
Denzel, the last time we all got together, you said you really hoped that from this group, we would be able to make some change. You said, Trinity, that we are a small group, but we can be mighty.
Well, I mean, there's multiple things you can do. I think that, for one, that coming back into the community and doing things yourself after we finish our formal schooling. The second thing is that the civic engagement, when it comes to, who are the people who are allowing, for example, the education laws as they are now to stay in place or making them worse, right? So when it comes to this next election, which is the statewide and House of Delegates election and some state senators election, then if we are electing people who are in tune with the school system here in Northumberland County, or any of the school systems, not only the leaders of the school system and not only the students who do well, but the students who don't do as well. We're only as well off as our worst person. And that's not to say the person is bad, but in terms of how the person is treated and what they're able to effectively get out of the school system. So do we have representatives who are well in tune with that and are willing to act on it? And I would say at the moment we do have some, but not all. So when it comes to, I'll be helping out with the campaign for Reverend Linwood Blizzard, who's running for delegate, who's someone who is not only a teacher in the school system, but is someone who has fought to reform it ever since he has been in the area. So that also goes to school board elections, either helping out or getting involved yourself. But if you were to talk about immediacy, it's hard to affect these things very immediately because it does take convincing quite a few people to change the way they do things, and that takes a long-term effort, either forming an advocacy group or becoming part of a group that's already doing this advocacy. And I think that it may be much easier to, mobilize resources and groups that are already kind of doing this work or could be expanded to do this work. And that's why I think politics is an easy way of doing it. Another way to do it would be to have these conversations as part of, for example, the NAACP or getting along with them so that you can mobilize their resources and their position to be able to sit down with the principal of Northumberland High School or something like that, if that makes sense.
Again, you have to vote. So, and we have many people who don't understand the power of the vote. So Denzel, that's a really great point to bring up.
Yeah, fortunately, the state of Virginia has made it a lot easier to vote. And we saw that from the results of the last election, that voter turnout was up in all parts of the states. So hopefully, this will be the first time that those positions are up for election during these times where it's easier to vote. So, and that's something that I will be working on doing, not only getting people out for the candidate that I'm supporting in terms of working for the campaign, but getting people out to vote, period.
What Denzel was saying, collaborating and mobilizing the resources of different bodies and groups that are already being formed and are already formed now. Like, I know Richmond County has a multicultural committee. If we could us as a unified group, coming to them and talking with them, having conversations with them, and seeing what work there is we can do there, wherever they are. Going to the school board meetings, sitting and talking, presenting whatever any findings we had, and also one thing I was thinking about is there's a growing demographic after so much political tension and unrest. There's like a lot more young people that are ready to be politically involved, and maybe like a early registration or a voter registration workshop for like seniors and juniors that are turning 18. maybe like at the school or at a building close to the school. I thought that would be a good idea.
And I was just going to say that I kind of agree with what you were saying, Jane, about the power of the vote. And I believe that a lot of change is just going to come from just getting the right people who are willing to take action in places of power where they're able to do that. Because I've had conversations with people who have said things like, well, you know, we can just try to like change the people who are racist. And personally, I don't think that on a large scale that will happen, just because of the fact that racism runs so deep in some people's minds and it's just so like hateful that it's not something that will change in an adequate time to really provide change for marginalized communities. I really feel like just getting people who are adequate and knowledgeable and ready to make change happen in places where they can do that is the best way to make change.
I would agree with everyone here, especially Denzel when he was saying that it may not be an immediate change, you know, dealing with the school to prison pipeline. But I think, especially in Northumberland County, we are very slow to change because we have a lot of people here that are not welcome. They're not welcoming to change. But we have a very large young population. And I think Kel mentioned maybe the early voters registration, like maybe holding a workshop for that. I would love to be on that, especially because I work at the school now. I would love to spearhead or figure out who would do that, because I think that's very vital. A lot of our young kids do not vote. But I do know Denzel was talking about Pastor Blizzard. He is my pastor. He's also Colette's pastor. He buses people to voting sites. He makes sure, like, if you don't have a way, we'll find you a way. And I think that's very important, especially in a rural community like the one we live in. And like Michael said, as a young kid saying, hey, this is what we could do to increase our voting numbers, that's huge. And that's coming from, you know, a minor. So if he's having these thoughts, why aren't people who have been doing this forever not having these thoughts? And I think part of it is, like I said, they're not as open to change. And I think maybe a more immediate solution would be talking about the school to prison pipeline, but in our curriculum. Because why can't we? Why can't we talk about this in our curriculum? It could be added to our classes. We do a lot of like training. I know the teachers do a lot of professional development, but maybe we should do that for students. Maybe we should hold a workshop. And I'm not sure if anyone would be open to doing that, but I'm open to opening my mouth and saying that to someone, because I do think it's important, because I do think it could change the lives of many kids, especially because when they leave the high school with a packet this thick, that packet really, delegates what they're going to do in life. To be honest, how many people, how many employers are going to hire people where they see that their rap sheet is pages long? A lot of people are not okay with that, and people change. So it's not fair to judge kids off of what they did in elementary, middle, and high school. It's not fair. And I think that is another issue we have. We're writing off people too early. And like Michael said, we're labeling kids as early as kindergarten. And that I wouldn't want to be labeled by, as the person I was in kindergarten. I've changed a lot. A lot. It's been a lot of years since I was in kindergarten. Couldn't tell you how many, but it's been a lot. So I don't want to be judged as that person I was, almost 20 years ago. I want to be judged by the person I am now. And I think a lot of people have preconceived notions of who young Black people are in our community, and they shouldn't, because we have lots of bright, athletic people who are going to go out and do really big things that are bigger than the Northern Neck. But if you're not allowing yourself to see that, then maybe they're not going to see it for themselves. So I think that would be a more immediate thing. But like they all said, voting is huge. And I know the school board's having an election this year.
So something else that you brought up was the whole issue with the way that we discipline in schools, ISS, suspension, expulsion, those kind of things. What are some other alternatives that we could give that would be a little more productive? What are ways that we could teach, okay, your behavior is not correct. We need to fix the behavior, but I'm not going to put you in 3 days of ISS because that's not going to do any good. What else could we do to help those students who continually have those behavioral issues that end up in ISS over and over and over again?
One of the past middle school principals, I think it was from the Richmond area, but he came in and he had a program where he made sure that if there were troubled students and they were able to get through the year or the semester, one of the two, with minimal infractions, then he would reward them in some way. I think they had like a trip to Stan Skaland or something like that, right? So it was a form of taking this group of kids who usually feel like the only time they're paid attention to is when they're punished, and giving them an opportunity to be incentivized to do as good as they can. His program was critiqued by these school board members and by other members of the community as rewarding bad behavior. Often you'll hear forms of criminal justice reform. Often you'll hear people saying, well, they're treating the criminals better than the victims, is what people would say. Because people don't know anything different from just purely beating up and, if possible, getting rid of people who they believe is a threat to them and their community. So even that's just to say, even if we go in and do these things, people aren't going to like it. You kind of take this group of people who are repeat offenders in a way, who are people who are unfortunately have been for a long time have been people going to ISS, and kind of tell them like, okay, what you're doing is bad, but we're going to work with you, and we're going to make sure that you know that any progress you make is good progress. Because at the end of the day, you're a kid. These were middle schoolers. These are kids. I'm 20 years old. I still don't feel fully mature yet, right? So these are kids, and they're a part of their environment and their homes. You only spend 7 hours at school, which is significant. But when you consider that, over the summer and when the time you're at home, your environment affects you. And these kids may not be growing up in the best environment. So kind of taking it and letting them know that any progress they can make is good, and incentivizing that in a way. That's what he was doing, and I think that's an example. And he was the principal, and he made that decision. And I wish he had more support.
Something too that you said that caught my ear is it seems like they're saying that in cases like that they're rewarding the bad children, it seems, and ignoring the victims. But it doesn't seem like they realize that those kids are also victims of operating in spaces that disproportionately affect them negatively and kind of fail them in a lot of different aspects. And their behavior is somewhat like a reflection of ways that people that should be helping them are failing them, and systems and institutions that should be helping them are failing them.
As far as alternatives to ISS, depending on, I guess, like the ranking of what the offense was, I think that going to like having to go to like your school's counseling services to talk about like what's going on, what's happening, why is this going on? I feel like that would also be a good thing, just to give kids like a space to be able to talk about like what's going on, whether it be at school or at home.
So I think part of it starts with conversation. Like I said, a lot of these kids are labeled as angry based off the first instance. And I think a lot of kids would understand more or feel more comfortable with discipline, or with, what if people don't know why things are happening, then of course they're not going to want these things to occur. So I think part of it is we could avoid ISS, OSS, expulsion, kids getting more angry if we sat down and talked to them like, hey, these are my expectations. Here's where you are. This is what we could do. As I think a lot of situations could be mediated like that, and they're not. And like I said, I don't know if this starts with having some kind of development program or what, but I know that if I were to do something deemed wrong to someone, I would like to know why it's wrong and what I could do to fix it. And I think a lot of young kids are the same way. So what I'm saying is I think it could all be alleviated with a simple conversation.
So having discussions like we're having right here and now would make a huge difference. And thank you for all of you being willing to be here. I know your schedules are so incredibly busy.